Now we've got the chair of the Wisconsin Democrats, Ben Wickler. Ben, thanks for coming back on.
Great to be back with you, Brian.
So we just had a big primary election in the state of Wisconsin for the state Supreme Court. This has been called the biggest race that nobody's ever heard about. Can you explain why?
So nobody's ever heard about it because it is a state Supreme Court race in April of an off year, supposedly 2023. Normally, this kind of stuff is a total snooze fest, but it's the biggest election because this race will tip the balance of power in the highest court in the state that tips the balance of power in the U.S. Electoral College, potentially in the House, potentially in the Senate. Wisconsin is the must-win state. It's the most closely divided state in the U.S. And the Supreme Court makes decisions on questions like gerrymandering, questions around voting rights, and especially for Wisconsinites, this is a huge deal, the question of whether abortion should be criminally banned or not. And this race will determine all of those things. So that's why it's the biggest race, because everything's on the line. And now folks watching this have heard about it. Thank goodness.
Can you speak a little bit about Dan Kelly, the conservative in this race?
He's almost a cartoon villain. Dan Kelly is the Republican, or it's officially nonpartisan. When I say he's a Republican, I mean he literally worked for the Republican Party of Wisconsin as their paid advisor on quote unquote election integrity and helped talk to them about the fake elector scheme that Donald Trump put through. He is like the definition of ultra MAGA. He is backed by Leonard Leo, the Federalist Society supervillain who bankrolled and engineered the right-wing takeover of the U.S. Supreme Court and the overturning of Roe versus Wade. Dan Kelly is his guy. He is now also getting tons of support from the biggest Republican donors in the country, Richard and Liz Uihlein, who were the biggest funders of Stop the Steal. They're like the Koch brothers, but worse. So that's who Dan Kelly's friends are. And he is running basically to ensure that the Republican Party of Wisconsin, the Trump team, the far, far right, has a hammerlock on deciding what the law should be in our state. One thing that is particularly, I don't know if you want to say ironic or amusing, is that he's accusing his opponent of prejudging cases because she talks about what her values are. His whole thing is that he is a right-wing foot soldier, Federalist Society goon. And we know exactly how he'd rule on everything because he's been talking about it and writing about it and doing it for every year he's been a lawyer.
Yeah, and we do also have some samplings of rulings that he has passed down, and none of them stray in any way far from Republican dogma here. So one of the issues that's most important for me is just the issue of fair maps and election integrity, but in the actual sense, not the perverted Republican sense. But what would it mean for maps in Wisconsin if Dan Kelly is elected?
So Wisconsin is currently in a doom loop. And what I mean is Republicans in the state legislature have drawn gerrymandered maps to ensure that they'll be reelected. Every 10 years, there's a redistricting process. And what's supposed to happen is that the legislature proposes maps, the governor can accept or veto them. If they're vetoed, then you go to a court, and the court is supposed to kind of choose something that's a fair compromise. But in Wisconsin, unlike every other state, after Republicans in the legislature proposed their gerrymandered rigged maps, and our Democratic Governor Tony Evers vetoed those maps, the state Supreme Court just chose the Republicans' maps. So there's no way that voters could ever throw the bastards out. As the saying goes, there's no path for voters to say, hey, the Republicans have been screwing it up. Let's elect Democrats for a change, because the maps are so rigged that even in a year like 2022, when Democrats won the governor's race by 3.4 percentage points, Republicans came within a hair's breadth of supermajorities, 2/3 of all the seats in the state legislature.
And by the way, that's a foundational issue, because then not having representative maps affects every other issue that we care about. And one of those issues is abortion. Can you talk about the implications of abortion in the state of Wisconsin if Dan Kelly were to win?
So when Roe versus Wade was overturned, a lot of Wisconsinites suddenly found out that in the year 1849, the state legislature, before women had the right to vote, before the invention of modern medicine, the state legislature had banned abortion in almost all cases, no exceptions in cases of rape or incest. The abortion ban starts at 0 weeks. And the question is that law now in effect? And that question will come to the state Supreme Court. And if Dan Kelly's reelected, he will say, absolutely, that should be in effect. And we know that because all the people who are backing that ban have endorsed him in this race. There's zero question whatsoever. So if you want doctors thrown in jail for providing abortion care in Wisconsin, Dan Kelly is your guy. If you don't, we have to defeat him.
Now, if this race goes in conservatives' favor, when is the next time that we would have a shot at retaking the majority on this court?
This is a grim question. So the short answer, which is misleadingly optimistic, is that the soonest chance we'd get would be in the spring of 2026. That's the next time a conservative justice is up for re-election. But the reality is that when someone's elected to the state Supreme Court as opposed to appointed, they almost never lose re-election. There are 3 justices in the last 70 years who have lost an election for state Supreme Court while being on the bench, but all 3 of them were appointed. In other words, when you have an open seat like this, whoever wins this election is probably on until they retire. And there are no other Republican justices who are giving any signal that they plan to retire anytime soon. This might be our only chance for the foreseeable future to flip the balance on the state Supreme Court. And this is the only path to end the doom loop of total Republican control over laws in the state of Wisconsin.
Yeah. By the way, I will be stealing the word doom loop. I think that is the perfect encapsulation of what we're in right now. Ben, Ron Johnson won his Senate seat in 2022. There's obviously a contingent of Wisconsin voters who can turn out to elect a Republican. How do you plan on making sure that that electorate doesn't show up to elect Dan Kelly?
The thing about Supreme Court races in Wisconsin is the turnout is vastly, vastly lower in these spring elections than it is in the fall. What that means is that even if turnout is high by historic standards, it'll still be like half of what we saw in the fall of 2022. And that means there are hundreds of thousands of Democrats who share progressive values, who do not want a total abortion ban, who think we should be a democracy, who probably won't vote unless someone calls them or knocks on their door and makes sure they know the stakes in this election. And that is the core of our strategy. It's to out-message and out-organize the other side to make sure that people know the stakes and the issues and know that they've got to stop Dan Kelly and vote for Janet Protasiewicz for Wisconsin State Supreme Court.
And just as a quick aside, why do we have elections in April of an off year? Does this have, a lot? You hear a lot about these elections in Georgia and whatnot, where they have like racist histories behind them. Is that why we have this random election like so far off the beaten path of when we would normally have elections? And as a follow up to that, if so, if this was an effort, by conservatives, like a longstanding effort by conservatives to win these races, if they lose, is there any hope that we can then consolidate them into fall elections when there's a normal turnout?
So the origin of spring elections, nonpartisan local elections in Wisconsin is back in 1910. There was a bill passed in 1912, I should say, where the Democrats and the Republicans got worried that the socialists were doing really well. And they didn't want socialists to be able to win elections. And they thought that the Socialist Party had this advantage that people thought it was great. So they got together and they decided to move the local elections for offices like mayor, for judicial elections, for city council, school boards to the spring instead of the fall. The other way of reading that history is that they said they didn't want big city partisan machines to control what would happen in these local elections. It seemed like it was a plot against the socialists. And that's been the tradition ever since. So this goes back for more than a century. And it does mean that a smaller number of people makes the decisions over the government that is closest to the people, local governments, and these incredibly powerful judicial roles. We've got to treat this, though, like it's the presidential election of the century, because the stakes are vast.
So can you speak a little bit on Janet Protasiewicz? Why should people turn out to vote for her?
The 2 candidates in this race, Dan Kelly on the right and Janet Protasiewicz on the, I guess, middle left, pretty much everywhere common sense prevails. She is a lifelong public servant. She is not a partisan operative the way that Dan Kelly is. Dan Kelly became semi-famous in Wisconsin because he's the guy who defended Scott Walker's gerrymandered maps in court in 2011. That's how he made his bones and got appointed to the state Supreme Court by Scott Walker in 2016. During that time, Janet Protasiewicz was first an assistant district attorney in Milwaukee prosecuting serious crimes, and then a circuit court judge. She is somebody who has been just trying to serve the public and make our system of justice work for folks. She's somebody who will look at the law, look at the Constitution, and rule fairly and impartially. And what that means is things could change a lot because we haven't had that kind of majority on our state Supreme Court for a long time. You could call her progressive. Her values are certainly very progressive. But what she brings to the bench is a focus on the Constitution and the rule of law rather than carrying water for right-wing mega billionaires intent on destroying freedom and democracy in our country.
Perfectly put. Ben, what do you think the biggest obstacle is going to be in terms of winning this race?
The thing that I'm most concerned about is the wall of special interest Republican money that will come flooding into our state. We already know their playbook because it's the playbook they used against Mandela Barnes. It's the playbook that they've used in other Supreme Court races that they've won, like 2019. It's what they're already doing with ads that they're running right now as you're watching this. It is to incite fear. It is to cherry pick cases and put up images, usually of Black people who are convicted of serious crimes, and talk about how the progressive candidate let them off too easy. It is trying to use racialized fear to polarize an electorate in a state that is overwhelmingly composed of white voters. So the way to punch back against that is to make sure that we can out communicate them and make sure, both defend Janet Protasiewicz's record, but also to make sure that people know that all of this is a smokescreen for an agenda to criminally ban abortion and to destroy democracy so that the people who are paying for those ads can make more money and never be held accountable. That's what's going on in our state. And it's going to take people chipping in $5, $500, whatever people can chip in, tons of people chipping in to be able to out communicate the other side. And then we need people to volunteer, to make phone calls and knock on doors wherever you are in the country. You can put in your time and effort to make sure that Democrats get out and actually cast their ballots. That's how we win.
And we know, by the way, that their playbook is to act early and often, and they did that in the Mandela Barnes race by trying to define him before he was able to define himself. They're doing the exact same thing right now. Ben, where can people go? How can they donate? How can they volunteer? People that are looking to help, what can they do?
Go to wisdems.org, WISDEMS.org. That's the Democratic Party of Wisconsin's website. We are 300% focused on making sure that Janet Protasiewicz beats Dan Kelly on April 4th. So if you go to wisdems.org, you can click and donate. You can sign up to volunteer. We will put you to work. We will put your dollars to work. We will stretch every penny because these elections can come down to a hair's breadth. I want to make sure I mention this. The last time we had a race like this was in 2019. It was a state Supreme Court race where the internal polling on both sides suggested that the more progressive candidate was probably going to win. But a flood of Republican dark money came in at the end, and they wound up winning that election. The Republican candidate won that election by 5,962 votes. That's less than half of 1 percentage point, less than one vote per precinct across the state of Wisconsin. That is a microscopic margin. We cannot let that happen again. So we have to treat this race, no matter how good things might look, as though we're 100 votes behind. And if we put in that extra ounce of energy, we might be able to cross the finish line first.
And I would just also echo that sentiment and just say, we have the luxury here, for anybody watching, we have the luxury here of being able to consolidate all of our attention and focus and energy on this one race. We did it in 2022 with races all across the country in the Senate and the House. We did it in 2020 with the presidency and all these state legislatures. Right now, we get to focus all of our energy on this one race. Wisconsin is the tipping point state. It is always the most important state. So please, if you're able to donate or volunteer, if you're able to spread Ben's message to your friends and family, this race matters. This is the whole ball game here. Wisconsin is a state that we can absolutely win. So Ben, thank you so much for taking the time, and best of luck in these last few weeks here until this election.
Thank you so much, Brian. I really appreciate it. And what you were just saying, it reminds me of the Georgia runoff after the 2020 presidential election. Do you remember we had 48 Senate votes? If we won the 2 Georgia runoff seats, we would get to 50 and we'd stop Republicans from being able to control the U.S. Senate. Everything that has happened since then happened, all the Inflation Reduction Act, the biggest climate change legislation ever, the infrastructure bill after bill, the confirmation of the first Black woman to the U.S. Supreme Court, all of that was possible because as a whole country, we focused on Georgia winning the Georgia runoffs when nothing else was happening on the political calendar. This is the same thing. Except this time, it is not about the U.S. Senate. It is about the Electoral College in 2024. If we win this thing, Republicans cannot steal the 2024 election in Wisconsin, the state that determines the winner. So let's put it all on the line.